Todd Ream is on the line. Todd, are you there?
Yes, I am, Brian.
Hey, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. You know, you're fitting right in this morning. I got Todd Ream from Georgia Pundit. If you go every day, I recommend that. Go every day to georgiapundit.com and check out what Todd has written for the day and all the great things on his website. Todd, you fit right in today. I am so off schedule, I don't know which way to turn, and you are right on target for today's show.
I am so glad to hear that. I'm sorry I had a little forgetfulness.
Oh, apologize for nothing, friend. Apologize for nothing. Let's get straight to it. Todd was down in Hollywood, Florida, this past weekend at the Republican Spring RNC Spring Committee meeting. Am I correct on that, Todd?
That's correct. They have a quarterly meeting. Some of them are in Washington, and some of them are out close to the real world. I wouldn't say quite in the real world because it was a really posh resort, but as close enough for government work.
Todd, give us a brief summary. What is the committee? What is that committee about? Did they discuss rules? And you know, everybody's concerned and thinking right now about rules committee. You hear that. You can hear that 1,000 times a day. The rules committee, will they change the rules at the convention? What are some of the things? Give me a little summary of that meeting.
So let me first say that this is the first time in my political career that I can remember day-to-day activists who are not on a rules committee or something like that actually breaking out the rules books, because there's so much interest in this question of what happens at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland if nobody has a majority of delegates, not a plurality, but a majority of delegates on the first day of the convention. There was a lot of interest in this Rules Committee meeting because, and in the spring meeting in general, because they're making the last set of accommodations, the last set of rules changes, the last everything as a body before the National Convention. So it was kind of showtime for most of the committees, talking about things as non-political as which states get hotels, close to the convention center versus being 30 minutes away. There was a lot of media there interested in the Rules Committee with the question of, would there be a change in the rules governing the convention to go from using the rules of Congress, of the House of Representatives, to Robert's rules. The main difference is that some of these rules mavens, rules nerds, whatever you want to call them, thought that one set of rules or the other would make it more possible to have a third, fourth, fifth, however many additional candidates who don't meet the requirements of the existing Rule 40. Today, it appears that only Ted Cruz and Donald Trump would be eligible to be have their names placed in nomination. And the question was whether there would be a rules change that might make it easier to put somebody else, whether it be a Marco Rubio, whether it be a John Kasich, a Mitt Romney, someone that nobody's thought of yet. Who knows?
Are you telling me Are you telling me, Todd, the current rules would only allow for Ted Cruz and Donald Trump's name to be put into nomination? And if so, we're all wondering what's Kasich doing.
Well, there's an answer, and then there's the real answer. Under the current rules, only if you have the written support of a majority of 8 states' delegations can you be placed in nomination. It appears that Cruz will meet that threshold, and it appears that Trump, of course, will meet that threshold. Now, there are two things that can happen. The rules that are quote-unquote in effect today that include that 8-state threshold, those are the rules from 2012. They stay on the books until the next convention meets. The Rules Committee for the convention, not for the Republican National Committee, but for the convention itself, will meet about a week before the National Convention. And they will then adopt the formal rules, but it's generally thought that the rules that are in effect going into that meeting are a pretty good guide to what will happen. And so that's why there was a lot of interest. But really, frankly, I've been to an RNC meeting before, and the number of TV cameras, the number of reporters just dwarfed what I had seen previously when they were setting the debate schedule. So there was a lot of interest in this, and ultimately nothing happened in that meeting. Randy Evans from Georgia made a very cogent case that, look, we're in the seventh inning of a ball game. We, the RNC, should not be changing the rules in the seventh inning. Whatever the convention does, that's up to the convention and a majority of delegates to adopt the rules, but going into it, we shouldn't adopt any changes. And that seemed to be the overwhelming opinion of the Rules Committee members.
Well, some of the reports I heard, Todd, and seen, especially yours, and it's a great report that you have on Georgia Pundit there that you have put together. But some of the reports I've seen in the past, I didn't even, I like to say I pay attention. And I don't even remember a spring RNC committee rules meeting ever being reported in my lifetime. It's just a bunch of people get together and, make sure the hotel arrangements and one thing after another and some of the things like that, the nuts and bolts of the flow of the convention or whatever. But in the past, you probably wouldn't see a handful of reporters. And so you say, I seen it was packed, and even Cruz had some people there, and Cruz himself, did he go? And also Kasich, did they make an appearance there?
Cruz and Kasich both made personal appearances, and I was only down for the committee meeting on one day. The Cruz appearance was not announced prior to when he showed up, so I didn't know going down there. If I'd been there a few hours earlier, I would have been able to see him. But I caught up with one of his national advisors. I spoke to a person who had seen the Kasich strategic kind of game plan meeting here in Atlanta. And the reason for all this interest, the reason for these candidates going there personally is twofold. First, it is the largest gathering of delegates to the Republican National Convention before the convention starts. There are 168 members of the RNC. Each and every one of them is an ex officio delegate. So you could talk to more delegates by going to this meeting than by going to the California State Convention or the Georgia State Convention. To put it in scale, it's 4 times the number of delegates that Georgia elects. We're in one room, basically. And so there are good strategic reasons. To go back to 2 things you said, this is the first time RNC meetings have really been top of the news. That's because it's the first time, at least in my career, which spans some 20 years, that there's been any question who the nominee is going to be. Usually, by this time, you either have or are close to having a nominee who has more than a majority of the votes. So that's part of it. I think the other part of it is there's all this attention to the Ted Cruz strategy of going out and seeking the support or seeking to elect delegates that might support Cruz on a second ballot. The reason that second ballot question is interesting is because I haven't seen one of those before.
Well, Todd,
usually it's.
Go ahead. Well, let me just say this. Let me just say this now. I don't mean to interrupt you, sir. Let me just say this now. Paul, there's a lot of talk being about Paul Manafort that is in charge now of the Trump campaign as far as keeping up with the delegates and keeping his finger on the pulse of what's happening at the RNC, basically, is what he's been sent to do. And he has history with that all the way back to Reagan. But he was down there this weekend, and there's an audio of him talking to delegates or people at the RNC, and RNC, talking to RNC of, the Trump you see today, he's on stage, it's an act, but you're going to see a whole different guy when it comes around. Have you heard any talk about that, or what's your take on that, real briefly?
So I was in that meeting. It was a closed door invitational.
Oh, you were in there with Paul Manafort?
I was in there. It was
right.
along with about 300 of my closest friends. It was a very hot room. Apparently, the Trump campaign thought we should sweat because the AC was a little bit inadequate. But and so it was. Let me tell you, that was something. It was a milder version of something that we had seen before. Trump himself has said something to the effect of, he's been talking about how he can turn presidential, but it'd be boring. I don't want to do the presidential thing yet, because you and the crowd will be bored. To me, the part of that was putting the minds at ease of the Republican National Committee members. What I found more interesting about that meeting than Manafort was the next speaker up, who was Rick Wiley, and he is the new national political director for the Trump campaign. He had previously been Governor Scott Walker's the manager of his presidential campaign, and both of these guys, Manafort and Wiley, have a lot of history with the RNC. Wiley was political director of the Republican National Committee, I want to say maybe in 2014, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And so he was able to, in his presentation, he would refer to, his friend so-and-so from the state that he's talking about, or, he kind of made jokes with folks. And that sense of familiarity, I think that was part of the message. I think the message that Rick Wiley delivered, he came in, both he and Manafort were thoroughly professional. Wiley really got into the nuts and the bolts of the campaign, and it was the first time that I had heard anything resembling an election strategy from the Trump campaign. He talked about states that Republicans haven't been able to contest in years that Trump can put back on the map and compete for it. And he did it with polling information and maps and all that stuff. And so that was fascinating to see an actual electoral strategy come out of the Trump campaign. Even more important, I think, than that was that Rick Wiley acted very much like he was the guy in charge of the Republican nominee's campaign. It sent a subtle message of professionalism and of inevitability that, look, this is your nominee. This is how we're going to win going forward. And it was very effective. It may be that it's too little too late. But if the Trump campaign had this level of professionalism 6 months ago, I think we'd be seeing a different race for the president.
Well, let me ask you a question. Let me try to sum that up and see if I have it correct, because there is one more thing before I go, and I do have to run. I could just keep asking you questions about this. You're so knowledgeable, and we appreciate it. We're on the phone with Todd Ream from GeorgiaPundit.com. Todd was down in Hollywood, Florida this past weekend, and he was in the room. Yesterday, I watched the Paul Manafort interview on the morning shows, and the audio that's going around the national media. Todd, let me see if I got this right. The national media is trying to frame that conversation like, oh, there's two Donald Trumps, and the real Donald Trump is going to come out, and you don't know him, and he was caught on tape in secret. But what I gathered from it is exactly what I'm hearing from you is that Paul Manafort and the Wiley stood up and basically said Donald Trump will be ready to switch into a national campaign, ready to switch into a different direction. And right now you have primary Donald Trump, which we're all used to that when it comes to candidates. Am I anywhere close to that, Todd?
Yeah, I think that the national media kind of treated this as though it was this huge revelation, and if you had been paying attention, you had heard hints, I think, of this kind of thing. And one of the things that Donald Trump brought to the table was his skill as a reality TV star, and he sort of did campaigning as reality TV. And so I didn't feel like this was as revolutionary as the strategic stuff. I thought this is just, frankly, at some level, the media, some of the national media, trying to justify their expenses in going to the convention
Right.
that they thought was going to be about the Rules Committee. And now they've spent $10,000 to be there for 3 days, and so they have to have a story.
Yeah, that's the best we have. Really, I've got to close with this, and I know you have to move on. You have a busy week ahead of you. I know you're going to be at the state convention, and you're going to be in Cleveland, and we look forward to hearing reports from you on both of those. But Todd, before we go, now Kasich currently under the rules is actually not eligible to have his name put in the nomination. So it's got to be obvious that Kasich was down there this past weekend, and his campaign has to be working as hard on the Rules Committee to get it to where his name can even be placed in nomination. It has to be something that they're working on feverishly, because the way it sounds is Kasich could work all day long, and he can't even get his name in nomination in the current rules. So they have to be working to changing the rules. Correct, Todd?
Yes and no. I think that would be the preferred strategy, to have some certainty going into the convention that he'll be able to be placed in nomination. But I'll let you in on a secret that I heard a couple times walking around with all the Rules Committee folks. Motion to suspend the rules. That is what will ultimately be likely the vehicle to allow other people not named Donald Trump or Ted Cruz to have their names placed into nomination. Motion to suspend the rules.
We need to remember that, folks. You heard that here on Good Morning from the Office. Motion to suspend the rules. Todd William has told us that. Todd, I want to thank you so much. I appreciate it. You have been a great help of information for our viewers and myself, and I thank you for being available this morning. I've got to move on, friend, to something. I got to move on to the next thing.
Thanks for having me on. Have a great day.
Thank you, Todd. That's Todd Ream, Georgia Pundit. And don't forget now, go to georgiapundit.com and also check out the dogs. The two hound dogs, Thelma and Louise, there are up for adoption. Todd always puts dogs up for adoption.